Thanks, Professor Law, to introduce me. And so I'm going to talk related to the dynamics of emotional state in the brain and how it contributed to behavior. So as we know, the hippocampal amygdala circuitry is really critical and plays a central role in human emotional processing, also for animals. But the amygdala is not doing by their own. And they contribute this processing to massive, widespread connections across the whole brain. So, but conventional approach actually just take a different kind of tasks or conditions, average the signals, and ignoring moment-to-moment changes in the emotional processing. That is critical from a dynamic point of view. So this is conventional studies, focus on activation, representation, or connectivities. And also based on all these studies and now research and actually can group these kind of findings and find some critical features related to brain circuitry dysfunction of certain circuitry contribute different kinds of emotion dysfunction. And also network miswiring of different patterns could be also contributed to different depression, anxiety. And recently, a lot of studies going on related to using dynamic approach to address how actually brain regions or circuits dynamically communicate with each other and contribute to cognitive and affective functions. So I'm going to introduce 3 studies. And actually, all of these 3 studies are still ongoing, and we are preparing writing up our manuscript. All of this data is not published yet. So this first study, we're going to focus on amygdala circuitry. And based on animal models, this, left side and these regions, you can group into a basolateral amygdala, more responsible, related more responsible, I have to say, to emotion perception. And but the central medial amygdala, they are more. Oh, what's wrong? Central medial amygdala, it's more responsible for emotion response or emotion expression. And based on cyto maps, this is I think everyone familiar with it. It's we can extract these amygdala subregions in human and the human brain as well. And what we find from a static point of view, you can see, so the central amygdala, it's more connective insula or some other subregions I didn't show. But you can see central medial amygdala and basolateral amygdala clearly separable and also have integration with other regions. We call it integration and segregation patterns. But if we look into a dynamic point of view, what is going to happen? So we actually take out the time series of a lot of regions we are interested, and we break down into small windows, we have 40 seconds until 60 seconds. And we're using k-mean algorithm, and we find actually in the brain, it's not from a static point of view, you only can find this kind of pattern. But from a dynamic point of view, we can find actually 2 patterns. This one more segregated, this is more integrated. And then we're doing another experiment. We find it's this segregation state and the integrated states, they're actually quite significant on the skin conductance data. As you can see, we can find on the group level, also individual level. And what we do next time, we train a machine learning SVR algorithm. We train the machine learning classify. Actually, we can predict skin conductance data, the predict one and the real value, actually quite significantly correlated. So, and then we look into specific regions, actually we find it's a contribution of basolateral amygdala with sensory regions, with this PCC, MCC regions, more contributed to a segregated states. This is the weight can predict of the skin conductance data. But central and medial amygdala, they are related to emotion, more emotion regulation circuitry. That is significantly regulate the skin conductance data. But in the integrated states, they are another story. We can find the basal, central media amygdala, the more like a connection with central, like sensory motor response regions, but the basolateral amygdala most like a connected with the left side with left within like the amygdala circuitry and also other regions. And based on these studies, we conclude it's like a dynamic integration segregation amygdala circuitry may probably flex the spontaneous fluctuation of autonomic arousal. And these like patterns actually regulate with distinct amygdala connectivity with multiple different regions. And next, then actually we look into the how this kind of like dynamic could be contributed to emotional memory. And what we did, actually we also subject learning face and object that's neutral, and then we show just a face, and then we place, where's the mouse? Can you help click this little icon? Because this is, we place a, oh, but it's not that loud. Okay, that's enough. One time is enough. So it's like we have an emotional tagging face. We have a face here and just a really horrible female screaming son. And what do we find actually, it's like this pattern, actually this emotion tagging can enhance the memory, face object memory retrospectively for the past event. We actually replicate into different behavioral experiments. And if we're using regular analysis, like RSA, and we can look into the pre-learning phase hippocampal activity pattern with emotion phase, we actually find the hippocampus pattern more similar between pre-learning and emotion tagging phase than predict better of emotional enhanced memory effect. And so we also look into the amygdala hippocampus coupling, actually it's significantly high in emotional tagging phase. This is all from conventional approach. Then we look into actually using dynamic approach. We look into like using the like approach. I introduced the first study, and we find actually more like subjects have showing more integrated state, both at encoding and the post emotion learning and resting. They actually can predict the better emotional memory. But the segregated pattern, because this integrated pattern is more related to more arousal, right? As I introduced the first study, that makes sense. But the segregated pattern actually negatively predict of the emotion memory. And next, we look into the more large-scale network. As the really beginning I introduced, it's not only amygdala small circuits contribute to this processing, but the whole brain. So we defined 12 ROIs across the whole brain that's like responsible for emotion processing. And then we are using like a Bayesian switching dynamic systems. And this one, actually, we extract the time series, raw time series from these regions, and put these raw time series into the BSDS model. And this is, we can actually infer of as each single different time point, which states they are. We have actually go through 1 to 15 states. And we then look into the matrix and can do community detection, look into like what's look like each state. I will give you, so this, I'm probably going to skip this complex equation. If you're interested in these methods, my previous colleague, and Teng here and Cai Weidong, they are going to publish the paper in Nature Communications. And for our study, actually, this is a task and set of stimuli, and this is states. We only identified 5 states during emotional learning phase. This represents each time point. For example, at the first state, this is like highly correlated with the stimuli onset of when the stimuli -1 shows up, this you will see this pattern will show up. And if we look into more closely, so we summarize the 5 states, most dominant the first state, and they are occupied almost 40% of time. And then we look into this time, these states, they show up, it's not predict anything related to emotional memory. And second state, it's also not. But the third state and the fourth state, especially the third state, positive predict. It means these more these states show up, more often they show up, they predict a better memory performance later. And we look into the structure. The first state is more like a segregated. This could be, we think it's driven by from somehow it's resting or a homeostatic a state. And then we look into actually the more closely about the metric of the network. And we find actually for the second state and the third state, it's a lot driven to intermediate prefrontal ACC insula play a critical like a hop-like a role in this state. And intermediate prefrontal and the PCCs, people believe default model network region show up. And this is the third state. And this third and fourth state actually can predict the behavior. And the second question is we want to address at this study is we want to see whether this emotion state during during encoding phase, they were going to re-show up or replay at resting immediately after emotion learning. And what we did is, so this is just a classic consolidation model. So something actually offline information reorganization could be happened after learning, emotion, processing. And we look into this phase, actually what we train the BSDS model during emotion learning, and we take the parameters from this model, and then we apply this model parameter to predict resting state data. So it means we identify some states from emotional learning, then we apply these parameters to resting. And we can find actually in resting, some of these states re-show up, reoccurred. Okay, so then second is we look into that, it's this state, it's the first state show up most dominant at the emotion learning. Actually, they are not dominant anymore in the resting. But most critical thing we want to show is whether this reoccurrence of this state, they actually can predict behavior. And what we find actually, it's only in the second state. The second state, it's re-show up after encoding, and they can predict the memory enhancement effect. Okay, so this state, as I introduced before, this state is mainly dominant by intermediate prefrontal, ACC, and also insula. This could be related to arousal. Okay, so based on this study, we see hidden brain states at the emotional learning phase. Some states predict behavior positively, some states predict negatively. And the reoccurrence of these states immediately after encoding actually can predict better performance. And the next one we want to look into this, the large scale networks, actually the online, how online rewiring, how actually contribute to subsequent memory. And what we did, it's because previous study we have emotion learning phase, and then we immediately test the memory, right? Just after half an hour. And this study we actually also subjects learning both negative and positive, negative and phase as object association, and also we have neutral ones. We show this. We train the subjects in the side scanner have 8 runs. Okay, 8 runs. Then we test in the memory immediately and after 24 hours. This is including probably consolidation happened for this part. We only find really enhancement effect after emotion, after a consolidation, after 24 hours later. And then what we look into is we identify large-scale brain network. This is responsible both emotion and memory processing. And we find it's actually across 8 practice runs, we actually find it's the connections of these regions, these networks, actually gradually build up, increase. And then we find it's some of these links actually can predict a subsequent after 24 hours memory enhancement effect. At the first run, we only can find 1 link. And on second run, the third run, and I only show part of this data. And the third run, the fourth run, 5, and the number 8. it's actually at the end of number 8, so after the full session, 8 of practice, and we find it's like a gradually built up these connections. Medial temporal lobe, especially prefrontal parietal networks actually build up at the end of the practice. And we think it's like this, as gradually build up our medial temporal lobe, prefrontal parietal function connections play a critical role in like a memory, long-term memory retention. So to summarize, we're using different type of like a dynamic approach, analyzing our emotion-related state, like emotional circuitry in the brain networks. We find the dynamic states of amygdala circuitry, meaning integration and segregation, actually reflects autonomic arousal. And hidden emotional charged brain states, certain states actually can predict the subsequent emotional memory, and also post-encoding resting state. Reoccurrence of this state actually can positively predict emotional memory. And the dynamic brain network rewiring over like a practice, over multiple runs, and can predict long-term memory retention after consolidation. So I would like to thank my graduate students and the postdocs and the collaborators, and also the funding resources. Thank you. Okay, so I think the next